Well, you know what that means, Jim. It's time to move on. And here we are.
That doesn't mean that. We move on all the time without that.
Well,
That's just an excuse for you to hit another
no.
chord there. Chord? Do they call them chords, or is it a noose instead of a cord?
Well, it depends on how you see it, but that was, of course, the sign for the listeners that we're moving on past the Raw portion of the show, as they all know. Jim, before we get to the AEW portion of the show, a.k.a. Nightmare Theater, I wanted to read something to you. I recently got this for my collection. It's a book.
Yes.
It's a book by Hal Erickson. It's an old book. Syndicated Television, the First 40 Years. 1947 to 1987.
Ooh.
This is apparently a decommissioned library book from St. Louis. St. Louis Public Library.
They're big readers out there in Missouri. They used to be the show me state, but now they're just the write it down for me state.
If I go to Syndicated Television 1950 to 1959 sports, let me read you what they have for wrestling. I thought it was interesting. Wrestling 1950 to 59. We aren't about to risk life and limb by suggesting that television wrestling isn't altogether spontaneous. Let's just note that because televised matches always manage to resolve themselves within the tight time limits of 1950s television, and because the highlights always seem to take place conveniently within camera range, wrestling was the ideal sports event of TV's first decade. Then, as now, it was bold, bigger-than-life entertainment, though not as Hollywoodized as it would become in the 1980s, with just as rowdy a fan following as it enjoys today. For those early 50s TV outlets whose schedules couldn't accommodate the network wrestling events, KTLA, Los Angeles, began distributing its filmed Wrestling from Hollywood in 1950. The financial returns inspired a deluge of filmed grappling matches. Remember Texas Wrestling? And there was women's wrestling, a favorite of kids who'd come to school with tales of torn brassieres, stories just as authentic as Bozo's Cram It Clown legend. For the next 30 years, wrestling would fall in and out of favor, though of course it never completely disappeared. By the 60s and 70s, few wrestling programs were nationally syndicated. Most were regionally distributed to promote upcoming live events. A note, during the 60s, one brave soul in North Dakota attempted to syndicate matches featuring the sort of legitimate wrestling seen in colleges and at the Olympics. The poor guy lost his shirt. Some audiences want style without substance. So there it is from Syndicated Television, the first 40 years, 1947 and 1987, pro wrestling.
That's fascinating. And actually, they glossed over that Vince Sr. in the early days, some of the Washington tapes were syndicated in Washington, D.C., to narrow it down even further. The tapes were syndicated as well. He had a hand in that to different places. And after they got kicked off the network, well, the network went out of business. Dumont, Chicago still syndicated quite a few of their tapes because of their name, right? To various stations.
You know, I don't know what I have in my archives or files. I've never thought of this question until now, but I'd love to find out what information is available on how many television stations, how many markets was Hollywood wrestling distributed into in let's say 1950, 1951, whatever. How many actual cities was that going into?
Well, a bunch of them, because, and I remember Tom Snyder, who did the Tomorrow Show, late nights after the Tonight Show. It started at 1 o'clock on, I think they did it Monday through Thursday back in those days. But in the mid-late 70s, would talk about wrestling. He worked at the Atlanta TV station and was in Atlanta television when Dr. Jerry Graham was on top. And so he would refer to him, and he did the show where Vince and Bruno and superstar Graham, bunch of the talent was on before they got on network. But he always talked about, back then they called it Hollywood wrestling. And that was the kind of, it was kind of a derogatory term also for, people, that's that Hollywood wrestling stuff, because that's what they were seeing on TV in so many places when people were just starting to get television. So it was the first kind of name they heard, name brand, rather than NWA or whatever.
It's interesting too, because it kind of points out the turn in the business in how it started using television, because whether it was wrestling on the Dumont Network or the examples given here, Hollywood wrestling and Texas wrestling, both very different, but those were televised wrestling events that existed as is. When the local promoters started using wrestling to actually promote the events is when everything changed.
Well, but now that we've found out lately with more research that's been done by a lot of the people, just in wrestling in general, and some of my research, there was a local studio show in Dayton, Ohio in like 1951 on the TV station there that was affiliated with WLW5 in Cincinnati down the road. Lance Russell did a local studio wrestling show in Jackson, Tennessee in the early 50s before he did Memphis wrestling. There was a St. Louis TV show before Wrestling at the Chase that we culled from talking about the old St. Louis programs and some of the Bill Longson record attendances, etc. They were sponsored by a beer company and were on the air in St. Louis and like 2 or 3 other markets in Southern Illinois, etc., sponsored by that beer company in like 53, 54. So the local stations, it wasn't necessarily, the territories hadn't fully formed yet based on, if we get TV in Cincinnati, we're going to run Cincy and Dayton and,
right,
etc. But these early local stations that said, well, we've got a wrestling promoter in Memphis before they got on WHBQ 13 for the glory period in the late 50s. They would telecast on Channel 5, believe it or not. And it was so, it had 4 call letters back then. I think it was WMCT. But they would show like 30 minutes of the main event or right before the main event or whatever from the Ellis Auditorium on Monday nights. And none of that obviously exists. It was live. It probably was never taped. But the point is, the local stations were seeing the networks are getting these big ratings, and they've got, out of town wrestling shows from Chicago or Los Angeles, but we got a promoter right here. His wrestling is popular. We'll figure out some way and we'll get people to watch. And so it kind of, it changed in that at first these early TV stations were kind of excited to have wrestling, but then once that they kind of moved on with other sports and technologically, and it went off network, then the promoters had to go to the local stations to get TV to support their wrestling, which in 10 years before or less, the TV was trying to get the wrestling to support their TV.
And then in terms of Vince Sr. and his show, I guess one of the first markets that would have seen it outside of the home market was when he started supplying his wrestlers and footage to Fred Kohler in Chicago.
I think he may have, at least in the Northeast, they were trying to syndicate the Washington TV before that. That's why some of that footage of the Graham brothers and, the Lou and the stars of that time still exists, is because, what was it? Capital Wrestling?
Yeah.
With
Ray Morgan.
Ray Morgan, thank you. I'm older than I used to be. But I think that's why a lot of that still exists, and that was the 59 to 61 time frame.
Right.
Well, that was the same time as Chicago.
It's right around that same time. That's kinescope footage, because I first saw it. Bob Barnett got it years ago from Bobby Davis. It was Bobby Davis's footage.
That's right.
Um,
Well, there's more of the some of the wrestling's greatest heroes and things,
right, right, yeah.
and there's Kit Parker Films. Look him up, kids. He's a fine man.
No, but
But
obviously,
some of that still exists because it was flown back and forth across the country, and some of it was saved.
see, if you grew up in the New York area and you were like, young enough back then, or old enough, I guess you should say, to have some of the old timers, you would hear about shows and you realize they weren't syndicated. They were all local shows, like Wrestling from Bridgeport. That was just a
Yeah.
local show. That was just one of the many local shows. And then, like, doing research and looking into things, and I once asked Donnelly O'Jonathan about it before he passed away. He was on like one of the first ever live studio shows in New York, Nick Studio. They taped it on the west side at what was later became Sony Studios. Like, they just used the studio in New York. You never hear about that. You never hear anyone say, I remember studio wrestling from Manhattan. Never. But that was just one of the many options that lasted for at least a brief period of time as TV was being introduced, gaining widespread acceptance and selling, according to Milton Berle, because of him. But it was wrestling and Milton Berle. I mean, those were really the. I'm not no,
Yeah.
shouldn't just say Milton Berle because Sid Caesar may have a problem with that. But wrestling was one of the big draws, and again, the New York area, we had maybe a few more stations than most areas just because of the amount of people, and this was New York, the center. So we had, from the very beginning, there was 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, like 13. From the very beginning, you had all these channels, but
Hey, by the way, Louisville, which is the biggest city in the state of Kentucky, had 2 television stations until 1961, the year I was born.
what were the stations?
Channel 3 and Channel 11. And then 32 came, the ABC affiliate came. Before that,
311
the
and
other
32 were the first 3 channels?
311 and 32. There was no place for a Dumont network program or later on an early ABC network program. So the other 2 stations, who were NBC and CBS, would split them up at different, sometimes air them at a different time or sometimes drop one of theirs or whatever. It was just one of those things. But go ahead.
Oh no, that was really that was it. I thought that was an interesting thing as I was reading it. I thought I'd read it to you. Just an outsider, didn't really seem like a wrestling fan, talking about syndication. Not network TV, but actual syndicated wrestling TV. And, Vince McMahon's rise to prominence, so much of the strategy was built around local TV everywhere, syndicated TV up the gazoo, taking other people's TV and working with those networks. And, you think back to the days where some networks had syndicated shows from Hollywood or Texas or DC or Chicago, and others said we could just do something locally. Some TV stations would get a percentage of the local gate for the shows there. And that's one of the things Vince McMahon, really brought to prominence when he was trying to steal TV from Vern Gagne and different people.
Well, see, that's the thing, is that we said it started out TV needed wrestling. But then when the promoters started, the territories formed and the local and regional shows became a thing, the promoters needed the television. So one of the things they would go to the TV station with was, if you put us on your station, we're going to be running regular events in your town. If we're successful, you can share it, run us X amount of spots, and we'll either guaranteed spot buy, or you get 5% of the gate, or whatever the case. And then that existed until Vince started saying, I'll just pay you to run my show. And then another 10 or 15 years goes by, and now the TV stations start paying for the fucking wrestling again. So we've gone all the way from the TV, we want your wrestling badly, to, well, fuck you, you got to pay to put it on, to, we'll pay you.
Yeah, I guess actually in a lot of ways it's more similar now to those days we just read about.
Yeah.
It's a national show, not really targeting any specific area, just a national show. And if you find a way, they don't even promote their local shows. If they have commercials running, they're not effective. But it was a regular thing for the WWF into the early 90s. Not just local promos, but they would have this little image of a plane flying away, and you hear Howard Finkel, the World Wrestling Federation coming to your hometown. And they would talk about all the places, and they would name every town. You'd get excited waiting for something near your town. They don't even do that.
No, and at the TV tapings, when I started in 93, we were still doing promos. If we did, God damn it, you didn't sleep. No wonder all those guys did cocaine. 3 days of television. You'd do the Raw taping, and then the A show and syndication was Superstars, right? And then Wrestling Challenge, I believe it was. And so that was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You would get there at fucking 1 in the afternoon if you were talent. Office was 11 in the morning. You wouldn't leave till midnight. Besides all the matches that the people were seeing, you were doing the local promos in the back for Cleveland, Bret Hart versus Yokozuna, go. Pittsburgh, Bret versus Yokozuna, go. Fucking Dallas, Bret versus Yokozuna, over and over. And then international markets and sponsor spots and television station IDs. Be sure to watch Superstars of Wrestling on WAVE, whatever the fuck. So that was, sometimes I was in the back doing interviews after midnight when all the matches were over with. The people had left, we're still in the back finishing the fucking interviews. So they relied on that heavily until, you know, the cable war became a thing in the mid-late 90s.
Well, I'm sure TV will be an issue again later on this year.